for asking me. It's just a pleasure to share both of my interests in photography and philately. If I could just correct the introduction, I'm a fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, not the Royal Geographic Society.
Oh, crikey.
No problem, Wendy. It just makes a bit more sense to put the photography into context. So what I'm going to try and do this evening is cover 5 brief areas. We'll have a look at the history of photography as it's shown on stamps. We'll look at the way in which it evolved to be used as part of stamp design. We'll have a brief nod to the royal family. I won't spend very much time with them because photographs of the royal family on stamps could take up a whole evening. More importantly, the last 2 sections, I'll look at the international perspective, and then my favorite bit, I'll introduce some of my favorites at the end with some anecdotes and background talk. Just to put it all into context, we need to remind ourselves that prior to 1839, there were no self-adhesive postage stamps and no photographs in the public domain. I would say at this stage, I do understand and I know very well that these histories are very complicated. So I'm working on the simplified version tonight so we can make progress. So nothing before 1839 for either of us. And then during that year, we have the announcement of Louis Daguerre's process, a photographic process invented in France. It was announced to the French Academy, and in two goes. In January of 1839, we were told that it existed. In August of 1839, the details of the process were disclosed. Between those dates in England, William Henry Fox Talbot developed and announced his own system photography, which eventually became the standard from then right through till the beginning of digital photography. We'll have a look at that as we go on. 1939 also saw, somewhat controversially, the first use of the word photography by Sir John Herschel. And of course, the Postage Act 1839 enabled the start of stamps. Then in 1840, it all kicked off. We had the first studio in London, we had the first stamps, and from my point of view, more importantly, we had the first link between photography and postage stamps. Within 2 weeks or so of stamps being issued, the scientist Alfred Swain Taylor wrote to Rowland Hill and sent him some photographs of stamps. We'd call them photographs. They were made by what he called photogenic art, but they were sufficient to raise some worries about forgeries from those early years. The Holy Grail, of course, is finding those original stamps, photographs, forgeries, whatever you like to call them. We know they existed because we've seen the reply to Swain Taylor from Rowland Hill saying that he appreciated seeing them and could he see some more as the science developed. So how did the science develop? The very first photograph actually goes back a little before all the public announcements. And what is generally regarded as the first photograph exists on this metal plate, which is held in conservation conditions in the university in Houston, Texas. It doesn't look much, but in the laboratory, they've actually worked out that this is the image that's hidden in this plate. It's a view from the window in the estate of Nicéphore Niepce, just outside Châlons in mid-France. It's a view from his window. I've stood and tried to take the photograph myself. It proves to be impossible because of structural alterations to the building. But the window was moved by ½ a meter, which makes complete repetition impossible. But as for stamps, we start to see this same image appearing alongside Niepce as the inventor. The image was shown not only on this stamp, but it also appeared on a stamp from Mauritius somewhat later. Of course, photography is quite an attractive topic for some authorities, and some of the, shall we say, illegals or unwanted stamps have had a go at doing this. Camorras produced this as a celebration of a famous invention. Quite interesting because they got the camera wrong. The inventor didn't have bellows in the first camera, and the photograph, black and white photograph at the back, wasn't taken by Daguerre, who is actually pictured on the left. It's not a bad representation of Daguerre, but the rest of it, unfortunately, is totally in error. The first decent, reputable stamp celebrating photography comes in 1939. It's a celebration of the announcement of the discovery of photography. The man standing in the center is a politician and scientist, secretary of the Academy, announcing Daguerre's process to the world. You might be interested to know that there's an error, that 1822 should be 1826, but don't get excited. It's not a philatelic error, it's an error of fact that is now well documented. So you won't have any success looking for alternative stamps with 1826 on. As far as GB goes, we've been poor servants to photography. William Henry Fox Talbot invented a process which he called photogenic drawings. We mentioned it briefly. It was announced in the same year, 1839. It became the standard for photography with negatives and the ability to print multiple prints. It's never been acknowledged on a stamp, but we did have some scientists earlier on. When there was a celebration for the Royal Astronomical Society, we saw Sir John Herschel with his father, Sir William Herschel, and another scientist, Francis Bailey. Herschel, as you recall, I just mentioned, invented the term photography. He also provided advice on fixing of the early images. It's been suggested by some that the diagram of the telescope in the background has been engraved from the first photographic plate, which was Sir John Herschel's photograph of his father's telescope. But it's such a straightforward sketch that it's difficult to attribute it to any real source. Although Fox Talbot was never given credit or celebration on stamps, he did appear on the cover of two booklets in 1989. There are, of course, in all histories, some unsung heroes. Tom Wedgwood effectively invented photography with Sir Humphrey Davy. They sorted out the process of creating the image, but they couldn't fix it. So it only had to be in the light for a short while, and it went black all over and was no real use to anybody. In South America, Hercule Florence was a botanist working in the jungle. He claimed to have invented photography all on his own. Unfortunately, he didn't retain any examples, and his notes were lost for many, many years. Some of his notes were discovered in the 1970s, and it looks as though there was some credibility. But of course, time's gone on so quickly that he's not given great regard. To summarize the inventions in the beginning, this is probably the best set of stamps and the most accurate. The center stamp with the camera is very accurate. There is a camera held in the museum, and that looks as though it could even be a photograph. It's very accurate. And the two images of Niepce on the left and Daguerre on the right seem to follow the traditionally accepted portraits of those two inventors. Photography got off to a slow start for a number of reasons. Exposure times were very, very long. It was difficult to get people to sit still. So portraits weren't very popular initially. It was mostly scenes. But the real game changer came in the end of the 1840s when this lens was introduced. It appears on a stamp from Austria. The inventor, Joseph Petzval, is given credit, although it's his lens and not his portrait that appears on the stamp. From the 1840s, 1850s, there were lots of gradual changes in photography. There was a major step change in the early 1850s when glass plate photography was made available. Exposures were faster, a new chemical process was introduced. But from then on, it was a series of relatively slow step changes until we get towards the end of the century, when we start to see the growth of the industry and the industrialists stepping in. George Eastman, of course, is famous for the building of the Kodak empire. Alongside Kodak, we saw the growth of Zeiss. I guess a lot of people in the audience have probably seen Zeiss Icon cameras, probably their own, probably their fathers or grandfathers. But Zeiss Icon, great name in optical equipment. Interesting that they should celebrate 110th anniversary, not the sort of year you normally celebrate, but given that they were founded in 1845. 1945, the centenary, wasn't the year for celebrating anything really. So we've got photography. What are we going to do with it in terms of designing stamps? GB did virtually nothing, but we started to see the colonies or the Commonwealth countries make use of photographs. This is one of the earliest engraving made from a photograph taken by W&D Downey. Famous portrait photographers established themselves in Newcastle, became involved as Royal photographers, and several of their works are held in the Royal collection. This is a photograph of Queen Victoria, used as a basis for the engraving for that Newfoundland stamp very early on. The Americans were also quite early to use photographs as the basis for stamp design. These two are probably the earliest because they were engraved from daguerreotype photographs, and daguerreotype photographs were more or less supplanted in the early 1850s. Both of these politicians died in 1852. So, excuse me, we know for sure that their photographs must have been taken on the daguerreotype process because there was nothing else available in America at that time. Another early story is the beginning of the relationship between photography and airmail. Balloon mail was quite popular. It was known and used fairly widely by this time, but it suggested that this is the first use of microphotography to load multiple messages into a balloon to get them carried out, in this case out from the siege of Paris. It's been suggested, but not proved, that those containers on the left contain multiple micro photographs that were to be loaded on the balloon and flown out of the siege site. This is the use of a photograph that shows the first living person, apart from a head of state, to appear on the photograph. It's not easy and it's controversial. It's said that the man indicated at the arrow, Evan Nybacken, known as Ed, disgraced himself by losing his hat in the wind, and he's said to have gone to his grave regretting that it wasn't his face that appeared on the stamp as the first living person. The controversy that surrounds the photograph rather than the stamp is that some people claim it would have been impossible to assemble this number of horses and ploughs on one site at that time. But nevertheless, the photograph exists in the university library in Dakota State University. As far as this country is concerned, the first attempt to use a photograph as the basis of stamp design occurred in 1911, when we have the famous Downey head. It didn't last very long. It suggested that the responsibility for this really rested with George V, who insisted that he had some new photographs taken for use on stamps. But he used W&D Downey again. They were portrait photographers, and for them it was quite natural to take a three-quarter portrait. But in fact, most people, and certainly responsible people as far as the state was concerned, wanted a profile of a more traditional kind, and they used the coinage head for the rest of his stamps. We come to the next sovereign, Edward VIII. Aside from the controversy of his own life, there was a minor controversy regarding the stamps. A student, one J.H. Brown, was a stamp collector, and he read in the Gibbons Stamp Monthly of the time that there was to be a competition for the Edward VIII stamps. It's thought that he misread a paragraph which said there would be some competitive tendering amongst the established designers. But nevertheless, he wrote to Royal Mail, submitted this design, and got a rather patronising letter in return. And he was told that we'd actually be using professional designers. In the end, as you know, the stamp turned out to be a faithful copy, effectively, of that student's design. It led to a lot of exchanges of correspondence between the student and the student's family, and they got an apology from the Royal Mail. Following the abdication, there was a bit of a panic, and we first meet Dorothy Wilding. These stamps were taken sometime before the coronation, and I don't think it's unfair to say that they were cobbled together for this purpose. I don't think anybody claims that this is a wonderful stamp, but it served its purpose, and it was done in a panic. Although Wilding had been used for the coronation stamps, her work was rejected for the new definitives. And here we start to see again a form of controversy. The George VI stamps, which we're all familiar with, were based on a portrait taken by Bertram Park. But if you read the literature, it's the stamp designers that get the credit. And in fact, the portrait is referred to as Dulac's portrait. And although it wasn't reproduced photographically, it was engraved, but it was certainly based on the portrait by Bertram Park. And Park became famous as an engraver, as a photographer used by engravers for stamps pretty much around the Commonwealth. 20 of his portraits were used in a range of stamps, and all the evidence is now held in the Postal Museum. Park's daughter eventually gave her father's work over to the museum some years ago. Towards the end of George VI's reign, we have the Silver Jubilee. And although it was Bertram Park whose work had been used for the definitives, Wilding, still popular, very important social photographer, large portfolio of aristocrats as clients, she was called upon to do the portrait for the Silver Jubilee stamp. And I know a lot of people think that that's one of the best GB stamps. Shortly after the Jubilee, we have the passing of the King and the new monarch. This is a photograph of a photograph. There's a portfolio held in Windsor Castle where most of the Royal Photographic Collection is housed. And on a visit there, I came across this portfolio and got permission to take a photograph of it. I would just add that the Royal Collection Trust are very, very generous. And it's very easy to get permission to use copies of their photographs for non-commercial purposes. This is said to be one of the working copies. You see, we've got examples of the tones and notes around. This seems to be the basis of the Wilding stamp. And then Wilding's with us in this form for about 15 years. The one thing about Dorothy Wilding is that almost everybody knows about the GB Wildings, but it's easy to forget that she had stamps and portraits all around the world. This little selection actually mimics an illustration in a photographic exhibition catalogue. Wilding was so important as a photographer, not just to philatelists, but to the photography world generally, that the National Portrait Gallery set up a major collection, a major exhibition of her work. And Terence Pepper wrote a book to go with the exhibition. And on one of the pages, there's a black and white image of this panel of stamps. I thought it would be quite a good idea to actually reconstruct it and get hold of all the original stamps and then rephotograph it, which is what you see in front of you. So following the Wildings, we have the Machin era, much more complex than can be told in one evening. It's contrary to what Mr. Machin might have you think, lots of time was spent on the photography of Dorothy Wilding, Lord Snowdon, Anthony Armstrong-Jones as was, and Anthony Buckley, as well as John Hedgecoe. And it's thought that lots of consideration was given to the use of the photographic work, and possibly, as you can see from this, it's thought that John Hedgecoe's portrait may have influenced the final output. But if you consider what Machin says, it's easy to believe that he was the only photographer ever involved. So I'd like to move on now from the definitives and talk about just a few royal stamps, only a few, but a few that I think are perhaps interesting. I've included this one because if any of you are also in photographic societies as well as philatelic societies, there will be somebody in your club that follows this technique or follows this project of photographing now something that existed in photographic form years and years ago. This is exactly what happened with the golden wedding issue. This stamp was taken, the stamp on the left was taken at the royal wedding. It was never used at that time for the stamp, but it's easy to see that we've got a then and now sort of photographic project. I have to make mention of these. They're probably the most, shall we say, sentimentally remembered stamps. They're beautiful portraits, beautiful photographs in their own right. We know who the photographers were, and 2 of them were taken by Lord Snowdon. This I find amusing, probably in a silly way. I remember assembling our family for my mother's 80th birthday. I can just imagine the Queen turning to the lads and saying, "Don't forget on Sunday, clean shirt, best suit, grandma's coming, we're going to have a photograph taken." This is a genuine family photograph. When I do this talk on a face-to-face basis, I usually ask the audience, who is this lady? And unfailingly, half the audience say that it's Princess Margaret. From a photographic point of view, this turns out to be very, very interesting. It's not Princess Margaret, but in fact, it's a photograph of the Queen, but taken by Princess Margaret's husband, who is a photographer. And it's very clear that he imposed, probably accidentally, his style on the portrait. What I find really interesting is that now we've got the memorial issue for the Queen. It's only these 4 on the left that have been reissued. This photograph that is frequently confused as possibly Princess Margaret, which it's not, has been left out of the memorial set. So let's move on to have a look at some of the countries. And an easy way of starting to see how photography was celebrated is to have a look at what different countries did with the 150th years of photography in 1989. Several of the countries acknowledged the celebration, but used stylized design. We've got cartoons here, stylized designs from around the world: Bulgaria, Sweden, Hungary, Finland. Hungary is a strange one because Hungary has got a great reputation for providing photographers, and we'll see some of their work before we're finished. But some of the countries were faithful to photography. Australia was very faithful to the detail. Rather than celebrate 150 years of photography in 1989, they moved it on to 1991 because, as far as Australia was concerned, photography only arrived in 1841. It took 2 years for it to move from Europe to Australia. And in 1841, Captain Lucas demonstrated the process in Sydney. Canada, lots of celebrations, and one might argue that they've gone over the top. I don't think they did. They're great supporters of photography. They issued 4 sets, 4 stamps on the day to celebrate 150 years of photography. But much later and much more interestingly, they started to celebrate 150 years of photography in Canada. And they issued booklets for a series of years, a 5-year set, year by year, producing wonderful stamps. And we have a Canadian in the audience, and I would just emphasize again that the Canada Post have been great servants to photography, wonderful reproductions and extensive use and acknowledgement of photographic images. Bermuda celebrated 150 years of photography, but it's a bit of a puzzle. They chose 6 images from their museums, from their photographic archives, but they didn't name the photographers. If they'd gone to the trouble of getting photographs from the archives, one would have expected them to choose for a celebration at least photographs that could be identified. Whilst some countries were celebrating photography, others simply celebrated their photographers. This is from Andorra, celebration of the work of Joseph Alsina. From Austria, contemporary celebration of the work of architectural photographer Margherita Spilatini. Further into Europe, we've got the Czech Republic celebrating a couple of photographers here. The one on the left is, I would say, somewhat unknown, but on the right, Joseph Sudak is highly regarded throughout Europe, and English students of photographic history will be familiar with the work of Joseph Sudak. And he gets not a photograph on the stamp, but he does get a stylized image of himself at work. France, of course, the home of Daguerre, celebrated photography quite widely. We've got a set of 6 here. There were charity stamps issued to support the Red Cross, and each stamp is by a well-known name in photography. Certainly names that are well known to photo historians, and some that will be known well outside the field. Henri Cartier-Bresson is probably known to a lot of people well beyond photographic history. In Jamaica, they took a slightly different approach. They actually got hold of very early photographs by Adolphe Dupley, who introduced photography to the Caribbean, and they reprinted them and colorized them and printed them in a miniature sheet with the story of his introduction to photography. And this photograph here is the sort of thing that you would have seen as one of his originals. These are all based, these colorized images are all based on his original work. Poland, not as generous as Canada in its recognition of photographers, but certainly well ahead of many other countries, produced a series of stamps celebrating photographers and periods in the photographic history of the country. Lithuania, again, a photographer little known outside Lithuania, but certainly acknowledged. Sweden produced a miniature sheet or booklet containing a miniature sheet acknowledging 5 of their photographers. Slovenia produced a stamp celebrating the life of Janos Pur, an interesting character. Both on the stamp and in the photograph, he's holding his notebook. It's claimed that he was the inventor of glass plate photography. Copies of that notebook have circulated in many of the science departments of universities around the world. Nobody has been able to make a satisfactory photograph from Pur's notes, and nobody's ever found any of his work. So something of a mystery. America, of course, does things in a big way. They celebrated American photography and produced this sheet of stamps, each one by a separate renowned photographer. And even the little man on the rock was a known photographer. Jackson was eventually inducted, as happens to many Americans, into a Hall of Fame. The Americans have a Hall of Fame for photographers. We'll be seeing a couple of these examples later in larger format, but they did it big. They celebrated photography in a big way. I'm going to go on now with a series of unconnected but interesting examples. Some of them are sad, some I think are amusing, and some are just curious. The first one, this is a photograph of the Korean War Memorial taken by David Jones of Nottingham on holiday in America. The same memorial appeared on a stamp. The original photograph from which the stamp was engraved was taken by an amateur, John Alley. He was on holiday, he was an ex-Marine, had probably served in Korea, wanted a personal souvenir. At a later date, when the US Mail wanted his photograph, they gave him $1,500 for the use of his image, and he was absolutely delighted. It wasn't very long before there was a claim from the sculptor who said, "Hey, forget the photograph, you're actually copying my sculptor." And as the way things go in America, it led to a whole series of legal actions, and the sculptor was eventually awarded over 600,000 damages for the use of his image. This is George Elser. He's the man who tried to assassinate Hitler. He's taken as a role model by the Secret Service as being the way to have a secret. He told no one. He hollowed out a space in a pillar at a venue that he knew Hitler was going to speak at, and loaded it with explosives. Unfortunately, due to the weather, Hitler was 13 minutes late. The explosion went off, damaged a lot of people, but not Hitler. If you want to pursue that, there is a film called 13 Minutes, which tells Elsa's story. And the professional spy masters make the point that Elsa told absolutely no one, and that's the only way to keep a secret. A more recent issue about an earlier tragedy. This is Private Tickle, who appeared on one of our GB stamps. That was taken from a photograph of Mother's Billy Boy. I find that quite moving. Personal story. Brian Adams, pop star, photographer, philanthropist. I had the pleasure of meeting him in 2017. I remember meeting him. He won't remember meeting me. He on one occasion came to London for an event related to the Prince's Trust. And because he was a photographer, it was arranged that he could have 5 minutes to take a portrait of the Queen. He did so, went back to Canada, and this stamp appeared on several of the definitive issues. South Africa, during the siege of Mafeking, they ran out of stamps. Well, why would you want stamps in a town that was under siege? Where are your letters going to go? But in fact, Lord Baden-Powell, who was a senior officer in charge of the garrison under siege, had arranged for runners to take out mail under the cover of darkness. So it wasn't a complete siege, although they weren't able to move in any goods. When they ran out of stamps, a local journalist recalled from his training that the process, very basic process, used to create blueprints, the cyanotype process, and he got people within the town to take photographs of Baden-Powell and a cadet sergeant on his bicycle, and they printed their own stamps. These stamps have become quite scarce. I had a lot of explaining to do when I acquired these. Mrs. Blackwell wanted to know what the item was on the domestic budget, but we fudged it somehow. This is a photograph of the cadet corps. The sergeant's on the right. The cadets were used to do jobs to supplement the work of the soldiers during the siege. They were messengers, carrying goods for the soldiers, and eventually Baden-Powell being involved, saw this corps of cadets as a model that was eventually to become the Boy Scouts. Another personal story, I could say I was there, but not really. I wasn't there when the cyclist achieved what he did, which was the first English or British cyclist to complete a stage and to win a stage in the Tour de France. But in 2014, I was representing the Royal Photographic Society at the opening of an exhibition of photography in Barnsley, of all places. But the work was all about people either born in or strongly connected to Yorkshire. Among others, Dickie Bird was there, had a chance to talk to him. And I found this old man sat on his own and really feeling guilty that nobody was talking to him. I went and sat at the side of him, asked him why he'd come to the exhibition, and he told me that he was Brian Robinson, and we had a chat about his achievements, and he signed his page in the exhibition catalogue for me. I've included this because, although not unique, I find it curious that two countries should issue stamps that are effectively identical except for the country name. Contemporary photographic work, I just thought it was interesting and I'd share it with you. Nick Lockett is a local photographer, local to us, lives across the border in Derbyshire. Took this photograph when he was working for ITV. It was a photograph intended and in fact was used in TV Times. A little later, when GB issued a set celebrating ITV, his photograph was adapted. The poor old sergeant was eliminated and more stayed on. I've spoken to Nick about this a couple of times. He's a bit sad that the sergeant's gone, but he's even more annoyed that his work's on a second-class stamp and not a first-class stamp. Our friends from Canada will know all about this. Blue Nose is a racing schooner of great reputation in Canada. I would go so far as to say it seems to me, as an outsider, to be almost part of Canada folklore. From a philatelic point of view, it's interesting. It was voted the most beautiful stamp in the world in 1934. I'm not sure whether many people would still agree, but it's still, I think, a great stamp. It was made up of engravings from 2 photographs by Wallace Robinson McCaskill. It's also a super stamp from a collector's point of view because it keeps on giving. The stamp was issued celebrating Captain, the captain of the schooner when it won major prizes. The stamp was reproduced on a stamp for a youth philatelic exhibition. There was a stamp showing the naval architect. And then again, Blue Nose was celebrated on another stamp, although this one is not a photograph, it's from a painting. But only recently was I in touch with Captain Walter's family, and within the last 2 weeks, I've had permission to reproduce a black and white photograph from the family collection of Captain Walters, and that will appear in future talks. A little bit of nature photography here. This photograph on the left is held in German military archives. The pigeon was flying over enemy territory taking photographs. It's quite clear to see that the photograph was flipped and then effectively copied for this stamp issued by Niger. I find this one a bit of a puzzle. The train overshot at Montparnasse station in Paris. Unfortunately, it killed the newspaper vendor standing outside. No one else was seriously injured. The question I have to ask myself is, why would a group of philatelists choose this design as something to celebrate when they have a salon in Paris in 2017? Why would we celebrate the tragedy? It's probably right that I should share a favourite, but it's only one of many favourites. Man Ray, his work here on the left is one that appeared in the larger sheet of American stamps. And the one on the right is, I just think, a great photograph, and to have it appear on a stamp, I found very pleasing. There are billions of photographs and many millions of stamps. So how do we find one or two that are iconic? I think most people are familiar with this stamp, even outside of photography. This lady, Florence Owens, appeared in a TV documentary. The story is that Dorothea Lange, working on a photographic assignment in the Depression, took this photograph on condition that it wasn't given publicity. It appeared in the newspapers the next day. Florence Owens tried to remain anonymous, and it was only fairly recently, in terms of history, I think perhaps in the 1970s, that her name became public, and she told the story. She was poor, she was involved in the Depression, but she wasn't as badly off as many of the other people around her. She shared her food. She was actually in the workers' camp while her car was being repaired. I think it said there was a fault with the wheel, and she had to stay for a couple of nights with the pea pickers in their camp. But although she was poor, she wasn't the worst affected by the Depression. Dorothea Lange went on to have a great career as a photojournalist. The photograph at the bottom from the Depression is another use of an image in philately. This is by Arthur Rothstein. Iconic, yes. Controversial, again. It's alleged that we still don't know with complete truth who those soldiers were. The photograph that forms the basis of this stamp design was not the original incident. There was an officer on the site who realized that it would make a great image for recruiting, and he got the photographer to take the photograph and got the soldiers to do it again. But it lives on in American history. It was celebrated again in 1955, but it's pretty obvious that although it follows the same general design, the 1959 stamp was engraved from a painting rather than a photograph. When I talked to Wendy, she said, try and keep it to 3/4 of an hour. I think I'm going to make that almost to the minute. This is a photograph of Churchill that most people will be familiar with. It was taken by Karsh, and the story is told that Churchill was looking grumpy because of the incident that occurred. Karsh was ready to take the photograph. Churchill was smoking a cigar. The photographer asked if Churchill would put the cigar down. He said no. Karsh then fiddled with his camera as though making the final preparations, although he was already ready, and at the last moment reached out, snatched the cigar and took the photograph. That's the story that is told in almost every version of photographic history. I told this story about this stamp in a talk some years ago. The next day I got a note from a friend of mine who'd been in the audience, a doctor on calendar. He'd met Mr. Karsh, Geoff Karsh, in 1977, and on the quiet, Karsh told him it wasn't a cigar, but it was a glass of brandy. Now that leaves me with two questions. I know for a fact that if Ron Calendar told me that's what Karsh said, that would be true. But I'm left wondering whether Karsh, who repeated the story of the cigar in a TV broadcast, was telling the truth at that time and was actually winding up my friend on being mischievous, or whether in fact it was a glass of brandy and Karsh always talked about it as being a cigar to protect Churchill's public from his drinking habits. But there we are. That's it. Just about 45 minutes on the target. And my acknowledgements, work I've used in the research, and now I'm happy to say any questions. I shall stop sharing my screen.